It's dusk in Trendelag. It's 870 AD, and it is minus 22 degrees Celsius. That's about -7 for the Americans in the audience, and it's going to get colder before sunrise. There is no heating oil. There is no insulation foam. There is no glass in your windows, because glass windows won't exist here for another 600 years. The sun set 4 hours ago, and it won't rise again for another 16. You are sleeping in a wooden house that a strong man could kick a hole through, in a country that spends a third of the year buried in snow. And you are fine. Not fine as in gritting your teeth and counting the days until spring. Fine as in this is a normal Tuesday. Fine as in you will do this again tomorrow, and the winter after that, and the one after that, for your entire life, and you will still find time to carve a spoon. Here's what I want you to sit with. We look at the Viking Age, and we see longships. We see horned helmets that didn't actually exist, raids, and Ragnar Lothbrok's face on a streaming poster. What we never see is the boring, relentless engineering problem sitting underneath all of it. How do you keep a family alive, fed, and sane through 4 months of darkness and cold that regularly killed livestock, in a climate with zero central heating and a sun that barely clears the horizon? Because that's the actual achievement. Anybody can sail a boat to England if the wind cooperates. Keeping your entire village alive until the ice breaks, that's the hard part. So, today, we're going through all of it. The houses, the wool, the fish, the fat, the fire, the darkness, and what people actually did with 16 hours of night, every single night, for months. And by the end, you're going to realize something slightly uncomfortable. The Norse solved this problem so well that the thing we now call hygge is just a marketing word for what they were doing out of necessity 1,000 years ago. Let's go. Here's the misconception baked into the question itself. We picture Vikings enduring the winter, hardened, grim, gritting it out through sheer Norse toughness, like the cold was an enemy they held off through willpower alone. That's wrong, and it's wrong in an interesting way. The Norse weren't surviving the winter. They were living inside a system that had been engineered, generation after generation, to make 4 months of darkness not just survivable, but almost comfortable. Every part of daily life, the shape of the house, the layers of the clothing, the timing of the slaughter, what you ate and in what order, who you sat next to, and what they were doing with their hands, had been quietly optimized over centuries to deal with one specific problem. They weren't fighting the cold. They'd made an entire civilization out of managing it. And to understand how, we need to start with the least glamorous topic in Norse history: heat loss. You are a very inefficient furnace. Your body burns calories to make heat, and it loses that heat constantly to the air around you, through your skin, your breath, and every gap in your clothing. In a warm climate, that's barely a problem. In a Scandinavian winter, it is the problem, all day, every day, for months. So the first move is the building. Norse longhouses were built low, long, and turf-roofed, timber frames packed with sod, moss, and earth, stacked in layers sometimes half a meter thick. That turf roof isn't decoration, it's mass, and mass is insulation. Like the mud brick walls of a desert house working in reverse, a turf roof resists temperature change. It just takes far longer for the brutal outside cold to reach the inside, and by the time it does, the fire has usually done its job for the day. Inside, the whole house was built around a single long hearth running down the center of the main room, the Langolder. Everyone lived, ate, worked, and slept around that one fire, because heating one room well beats heating a house badly. Beds were built as raised platforms along the walls, lined with furs, partly to keep sleepers off the cold floor where the heat had already sunk, and partly because heat rises. Sit higher, stay warmer. And the walls themselves were often lined with woven wattle panels or wooden paneling, creating a dead air gap between you and the freezing exterior wall. That air gap is doing the same job as a modern double-glazed window. Trapped, still air is a terrible conductor of heat, and terrible conductors are exactly what you want between yourself and -20. Livestock mattered here too. In many farms, the byre, where the cattle and sheep lived, was attached directly to the house, sometimes sharing a wall or even the same long room. Animals generate heat just by existing, and a Norse farmer wasn't going to waste that for free. Your cow was doing double duty, milk in summer, space heater in winter. Here's where it gets interesting. If you build a sealed box and light a fire inside it, you have a heating system and a death trap in the same object. Smoke inhalation was a real and constant risk in early medieval Europe, and the Norse solution to it is almost the exact mirror image of the Egyptian wind catcher we've talked about before, except this one keeps heat in instead of pulling cool air down. Longhouses had a smoke hole, a leury, set into the roof ridge, usually fitted with a movable wooden flap or a translucent panel of scraped animal membrane. Smoke and the very hottest air rose and vented out through that opening, while the thick turf walls and low doorways kept the bulk of the warm air trapped at body height, where it actually mattered. Doorways were built low and often set with a raised threshold, specifically to stop cold air from pooling in and flowing across the floor. You had to duck to get in. That's not bad architecture. That's an airlock. Some houses went further, with an entry vestibule, a small buffered room between the outside door and the main hall, so opening the front door didn't dump all your heat into the winter air at once. It's the exact same principle as a modern building's double-door entrance, built 1100 years earlier out of timber and turf. Let's talk about clothes, because this is where the Norse were quietly brilliant. Norse clothing was built almost entirely from wool, and the reason is a stack of material properties that happen to line up perfectly with the problem. Wool fiber is crimped and hollow, which traps air, and trapped air, again, is the best insulator available before anyone invents fiberglass. Wool also keeps insulating even when damp, because the fiber structure resists water penetration into its core, absorbing moisture on the surface while the air pockets inside stay dry. That matters enormously when you're working outside in snow that's actively melting against your clothes. The system was layered, not singular. A base layer of finer wool or linen against the skin, a heavier woven wool tunic or dress over it, and an outer layer that was often a cloak of wool with the fleece left on one side, or genuine animal fur, wolf, bear, reindeer, fox, depending on what you could afford and what you'd trapped. Mittens were wool, sometimes felted, which fuses the fibers into a nearly windproof shell. Shoes were leather, packed with dried grass or moss as insulation, which is a trick still used by hikers today under the name fjellraven grass, except the Norse invented it 13 centuries before anyone put it in a hiking catalog. And here's the detail that tells you everything about how deliberately this was engineered. The finest, tightest weaves were reserved for outer wear specifically to block wind, while looser, more open weaves went closer to the body, specifically to let sweat vapor escape. That's not accidental. That's a population that had spent generations paying close attention to what actually kept them dry and quietly discarding anything that didn't. Here's the fuel problem. Your body needs a huge number of calories just to stay warm in that climate, on top of the calories needed for actual physical work, and you need to have already grown, caught, or preserved all of it before the ground freezes and the sun disappears, because nothing is growing again until spring. The Norse solution was preservation on an industrial scale. Autumn was slaughter season. Animals that couldn't be fed through winter were killed, and the meat was smoked, salted, or dried into skyr and hardfish rather than eaten fresh. Skyr itself, a thick cultured dairy product still eaten in Iceland today, was a way of taking milk that would spoil in days and turning it into something that would keep for months, packed with protein exactly when protein was hardest to get. Fish, cod especially, was wind-dried on wooden racks into screed, stockfish, which loses most of its water weight and becomes almost indestructible. You could store it for years and it would still be edible. And then there's fat, which nobody romanticizes, but which was doing the most work of anything on this list. Fat is the single densest source of calories available to a Norse household, and whale blubber, seal fat, and butter were treated less like luxury and more like emergency reserve fuel. A body running on inadequate fat in a cold climate burns through its own muscle and core temperature regulation faster, so a diet that looks, by modern standards, alarmingly rich in animal fat was, in that context, precisely correct. Add dried berries and preserved cabbage for whatever vitamin C could be scraped together across a season with no fresh produce, and you have a diet that wasn't designed with a nutrition chart. It was arrived at the same way the Egyptian beer ration was, a few hundred years of noticing what kept people alive through March and quietly repeating it. We've talked about the house trapping heat and the clothes trapping heat. The third leg of this is the fire itself, and the Norse treated fire management as close to a full-time occupation. Fuel had to be gathered and dried across the entire warm season, specifically to be burned in the cold one. Peat cut and dried in summer. Firewood split and stacked, and in coastal or island settlements with limited timber, driftwood and dried seaweed pressed into service too. Whale oil and fish oil lamps supplemented the hearth for light rather than heat, because with 16 or 18 hours of darkness a day at high latitude, you were not spending most of your life lit only by a cooking fire. You needed a separate, controllable light source just to do close work indoors, and burning fish oil in a soapstone lamp was that answer, centuries before anyone refined petroleum for the same job. And keeping that fire alive overnight, every night, for months, without burning the house down or letting it die, and having to start from nothing in the freezing dark, was a skill in itself. Banking the coals under ash to slow burn until morning is a specific technique, and someone in every household knew exactly how to do it, because getting it wrong meant waking up to a cold hearth and flint and steel in the dark with your hands already numb. Here's the part everyone skips. What do you actually do with 16 hours of darkness, every day, for months, when you can't farm, can't fish easily, and can't travel far? You go indoors, and you work with your hands, and this turns out to be one of the most culturally important facts about the entire Viking Age. Winter was when wool was spun and woven, when tools were repaired, when wood was carved, when iron was worked at the forge, when children were taught skills by firelight. The archaeological record of Norse textile and woodworking is staggeringly dense specifically because winter created an enormous, unavoidable indoor labor season, and that labor produced the sails, the ropes, the tools, and the carved ships that everything else in Viking history depended on. And it's also when the stories got told. The long winter evening, everyone gathered around one central fire with nothing else to do, is very plausibly the exact social machinery that kept Norse oral tradition alive long enough to eventually be written down as the sagas we still read today. Someone who lived through this world, the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson, wrote much of it down in the 13th century. But the material he was recording had already been passed mouth to mouth, fireside to fireside, through hundreds of dark winters before a single word of it hit parchment. All right, here's where this whole story turns over. We've been treating winter as the problem. Everything so far has been the Norse defending against it. Better houses, better wool, better food. But Norse identity, the whole cultural machine that produced the sagas, the craftsmanship, the mythology of Odin trading an eye for wisdom in the dead of a 9-day storm, that didn't happen despite the dark season. It happened because of it. Think about what 16 hours of enforced togetherness around one fire every night for 4 months actually does to a community. It doesn't just keep you warm, it builds an oral culture so dense it survives centuries without writing. It turns craftsmanship into something practiced daily out of necessity until it becomes genuinely excellent. It makes storytelling not a hobby, but the primary form of entertainment available to an entire civilization, which is a very good incentive to get extremely good at telling stories. The Norse didn't just survive the dark, they built almost everything we now associate with their culture inside it. Take away the 4 dark months, and you very plausibly don't get the sagas, because you don't get 4 months of a whole village with nothing to do after sundown except talk, carve, weave, and pass a story down to whoever's sitting closest to the fire. The cold didn't just get endured, it got recruited. Here's what I keep coming back to. There is a longhouse in Trøndelag 1100 years ago, a turf roof holding the day's warmth long after dark, a smoke hole letting the worst of the heat escape while keeping the rest trapped at head height, a row of wool-wrapped bodies asleep on a raised platform, layered exactly right, dry wool against the skin, wind-blocking wool on the outside, a pot of skyer in the cold room by the door, a fire banked low under ash, ready to wake up in the morning, and somebody, halfway through their 4th hour of darkness that day, telling a story they heard from someone who heard it from someone else 40 winters ago. Not one part of that requires electricity. Not one part of it will ever break in a way that can't be fixed with wool, turf, and hands. We've spent the last century solving the same problem with a thermostat on the wall and a streaming show instead of a fireside story. Meanwhile, Scandinavian architects are studying turf roofs again, because it turns out packing a meter of living soil onto your house was a genuinely excellent idea, and always has been. You'll get cold today too, probably, and you'll do something about it without even thinking. Turn up the heat, put on a sweater, sit closer to the radiator. Small automatic adjustments you won't even register making. That's the same species, the same cold, the same instinct to build a wall between yourself and the dark. The Norse family in Trøndelag in 870 AD was solving the exact same problem you solve every winter, just with better wool and no Netflix. 4 months of darkness, and the answer was never toughness. It was turf, wool, fat, fire, and a very, very good story. So, could you do it? A winter in Viking Age Norway, 16 hours of dark, wool instead of central heating, and skyer for breakfast. Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.